and welcome to Aucademy Bitesize, Autistic Basics. I am Dr. Chloe Farahar. I am a white person with a shaved head, giant glasses, and I'm wearing one of my favourite sweatshirts, which is navy blue with gold writing that says Aucademy with the infinity symbol. And I'm also wearing a badge that was a present that says, well, it's a little TARDIS, and it says, trust me, I'm the doctor. So these Aucademy Bitesize, so these autistic basics, are some of the key things that are very useful to know and learn about from the autistic community when you are on your own personal autistic discovery journey, or if you are a non-autistic person wanting to understand autistic people, experiences, the culture and community. And so I will be covering lots of small, hopefully very bite-sized topics in relation to autistic experience that might help you on, like say, your personal autistic discovery journey, or if you're supporting or understanding or wanting to understand another autistic person and their own autistic discovery journey. And so for this Aucademy Bitesize Autistic Basics, I am covering the autistic spectrum really in the sense of what is it actually and how is it meant to be depicted, because I feel that we've really lost in society in general this idea of what the spectrum was supposed to actually represent. So if we think about the diagnostic manual and how autism is currently defined. So if you haven't watched that bite size yet, please go and find the autism versus autistic experience bite size, where I cover the diagnostic manual definition. So when we think about that diagnostic definition, it's very much a list, like I said in the original video, of observable behaviours of distressed and struggling autistic people. It's not really about autistic experience as it is lived. It's just this sort of collection of experiences that can be observed that are then put together as an abstract concept of autism. It is very ignorant of the internal world of autistic people and how everyone, including autistic people, have challenges and strengths. Because when you read that diagnostic definition, it's very much about deficit and impairment and disorder and so on, implying that autistic people only have challenges. But as you can see on the screen here, everyone has challenges and strengths. And so when we think about autistic people, it's actually much more useful to think about, well, why is that person experiencing challenges at this point in time or in this context? And sometimes our challenges might be relatively fixed, but they might fluctuate. And that's because of something that Luke Bearden from Sheffield University made as a very brief equation, which is about how the environment plus autism equals the outcome. And so, like I say, it's not about struggling as an autistic person being inherent, meaning that it's inherent that we struggle. It depends on so many factors, and that means what is happening in the environment for that person that means that they're struggling at that point in time, and actually what's happening in the environment when they're not struggling, what's actually working for them, what good support have they got, and so on. Nice cheesy quote here as well to explain why it's much more important to focus on the environment first in terms of what is it doing and how is it impacting an autistic person, as opposed to trying focusing on, well, the autistic person, oh, they're challenging me, how can we change them? And so this nice cheesy quote, when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. Because actually it's much easier even if people are unwilling to change the environment than it is to change a person and their neurology and the way they experience the world. And so actually changing the environment makes much more sense. So knowing that if you change the environment, including your approach to autistic people or otherwise neurodivergent people, you can change the outcomes for us. You can see how struggling, for instance, is not actually inherent or fundamental to being autistic. And that is what's known as the social model of disability. So this idea of environment plus autism equals the outcome is that social model of disability. We are not inherently disabled, although disabled is not a dirty word, but we aren't inherently disabled. It is very much the environment that disables us. Now, it might not be the case that if we were to really alter the environment as much as possible, that we would completely reduce or just not have disability anymore, but we can certainly improve people's situations and circumstances greatly, and we may be less disabled if we think about the environment more. So, for example, our spectrums are not fixed. And so everyone, as I've mentioned, has their own personal challenges and strengths. And importantly, what that means is typically when I've asked people to imagine, if they think in pictures actually, because not everyone does, but if people are able to imagine the spectrum, how they envisage it in their own mind, they typically imagine what you can see on the screen, which is technically a continuum. So it is a line, for those who can't see the screen, it is a line with two endpoints and the color gradient. Now that looks like a spectrum because of the color gradient, but most people imagine autistic experience and this thing called the spectrum as actually a continuum where there's two fixed endpoints. And autistic people are not usually imagined or placed anywhere on that gradient other than the lower end of that continuum or the left, where people will imagine that that end of the continuum is so-called more autistic, in quotation marks, severely autistic, or low functioning autistic, all in quotation marks because this is all problematic language. And then they'll imagine at the other end of that continuum another fixed point, which is so-called less autistic, mildly, high functioning, or Asperger's, again all in quotation marks. And so you can see here that actually people don't depict the spectrum as this fluctuating color gradient. What is actually more useful and really what the spectrum was meant to represent is to depict autistic spectrums as circular spiky profiles. And so here we're now actually talking about an individual person and their personal spiky profile. So on the screen we have a circle, and within that circle or outside of that circle you have some of the abilities or experiences that a human being might have. So language, motor skills, sensory experience, perception, and executive functioning, for instance. This particular hypothetical individual seems to be struggling in executive functioning at that point in time. Executive functioning can mean so many different things, but it can include things like the ability to start, stop, or switch tasks. And this particular person seems to be doing okay, though, with their language ability, or so maybe their ability to use mouth words or verbalise in any other capacity. But what's really important is if we looked at this person's hypothetical, spiky profile at another point in time, it might change. Now, again, some of us as autistic people, some of us as human beings might have relatively fixed traits, but some of it is very flexible and fluid and changes dependent on the environment. So if the person's struggling, if they're not getting the right support, if they've got poor mental well-being or poor physical health, and that's having an impact on some of these things. And so a better way of trying to understand this thing called the spectrum is, instead of thinking of every autistic person who ever lived or ever will live being plonked somewhere on that static continuum, never changing, never growing or developing, is to try and imagine that line now as a nice three-dimensional round sausage. So it's now a round rainbow sausage. And instead of imagining, like I say, all autistic people who ever lived or ever will live existing somewhere on that sausage, is actually representing one autistic person. Instead of more low functioning versus high functioning on those two continuum endpoints, we've now got born, die, and a bit of living in the middle. So let's give this rainbow sausage a hypothetical example. Let's pretend it's me. So I am born as an autistic person, I develop as an autistic person, and I am obviously a very different person compared to when I was 3 or 4 or 5. And I grow and I develop as an autistic person in my way. And I do some living and I die at the end. What you can then do is take snapshots, if you like, of that autistic person and just look at their spiky profile at that point in time. You would have to build your own spiky profile and work those things out. There are some basic tools that you may be able to find online, but they tend to relate to business organisations for some reason. So at this point in time, I don't know if there's any good tools that you could build your own spiky profile, but you can certainly build a list of your autistic experiences and the things that you need and the things that you know impact you positively or negatively. But that means, yes, you can look at your sausage, your rainbow sausage life, and take that snapshot and say, okay, why am I struggling in this area right now? What's happening in my environment? Who are the people in my life? How's my physical health? How's my mental well-being? If I'm in education, is that impacting me negatively or positively? And so this idea actually allows for change. And so that's quite important, because obviously we don't for some reason look at a non-autistic child at say 3 or 4, and they're sitting there with their finger up their nose eating their boogers, and think, oh no, they're stuck like that, they're going to be exactly like that when they're 30 or 40 or 50. I mean, they might, who knows. But we seem to do that with autistic people, that as soon as they are recognized diagnostically as autistic, that's it, they're fixed and they're stuck, and they will look like that or behave like that for the rest of their life. But we are allowed to change, and that's what this spiky profile allows, or explains, or affords us. And because of my description of the rainbow sausage in so many training sessions where I've explained this, a fantastic autistic person who was in one of my training sessions created this for me, which is just beautiful. And so here you've got a much more three-dimensional depiction of that rainbow sausage, where somebody's born at one end, they die at the other, and during their lifespan we take a little snapshot of how are they doing at say 24 years compared to when they were much smaller. What is their spiky profile looking like? And so here you can see that flexibility and fluidity when it comes to being autistic. And very importantly, autistic people actually live in three-dimensional space, and so that's why I feel that we should just abandon the spectrum idea potentially altogether and start thinking of us as autistic people, still potentially thinking of this rainbow sausage idea where you can look at our spiky profiles, but actually thinking of us as, you know, planets or satellites that are moving through space. And so this is a quick picture here of an example hypothetical person's life, and it's depicted via Annette Foster and my theory of three-dimensional autistic space. And what makes us more observably autistic to other people usually means that we have more distress behaviours or just more observably autistic behaviours. But we're still autistic even when we're not that observably autistic to others. And so this just demonstrates why we're more likely to get recognised, for instance, when we're, say, 5. And maybe that's because at that point in time we're struggling with starting school. It's a very new environment, there's lots of sensory issues going on, it's very loud, there's lots of social issues going on, trying to work out other children that aren't autistic and don't understand you in the way that you experience the world. And so you maybe are having lots more meltdowns, really struggling to eat certain things, and just more observably autistic to outsiders. And so that is potentially when you might get recognised as autistic and get a diagnosis. And so you can see that your planet is more observable to other people. Now, sometimes we might get missed when we're children, and then as we develop and grow, we may start to mask, which I will cover in another Aucademy bite-size autistic basics. But very briefly, you know, we might be masking as a trauma mechanism or a trauma response to actually hide our true autistic selves unconsciously. And because of that, you might get to say 15 years old and you actually have really internalized a lot of your autistic experiences, so that you're much less observably autistic to outsiders. Potentially you're very quiet at school, maybe you are, you know, doing okay academically, and maybe you're only melting down in private or at home when you feel safe. And so your planet, if you like, is less observable. Your star is less observable to diagnosticians and teachers. And so you can see how we then as autistic people throughout our lifetime can fluctuate in how observably autistic we actually are. If you want a little bit more explanation and detail about the three-dimensional autistic space by me and Annette Foster, there's a link on the screen to one of our YouTube videos, or just head straight to YouTube, so the Aucademy channel, and look for our three-dimension autistic space to explain how we don't just live on this continuum line. Very briefly, and finally for this bite size, just remembering that yes, it's really important to remember that autistic people we do have our own personal strengths. They might not look like the same strengths as non-autistic people. They might not even be the same strengths from autistic person to autistic person. So yes, we do experience challenges in some or a lot of areas, but we mustn't forget that we also have strengths in others. So this infographic by the University of Leeds just demonstrates some possible potential strengths that autistic people might have, things like attention to detail or deep focus and so on and so forth. But really importantly, we actually should move away from having any extremes when we try to understand autistic people. We are not just people with autism with all these sort of very negative deficits and disorders and impairment, that we only experience challenges and distress, because that's not realistic. We also mustn't go in the other direction and say, well, even if we do have challenges, or those autistic people have challenges, it's okay because, you know, they might have those extreme strengths like savant math abilities. My maths is terrible as an autistic person. I'm letting the side down if we're going by the stereotype. And the reason I say this is we can't go to those extremes. Neither of those extremes is realistic or fair to autistic people. We are allowed to be boring and bog standard and average and have our own personal strengths, whatever those might be, and not compare our personal strengths to other people's. It's about, well, is it something that I feel that I'm good at or that I enjoy, and so on and so forth, that I'm playing to my personal strengths. So thank you so much for listening to this Aucademy Bite-Size Autistic Basics. Please do help support Aucademy in all the work that we do. All of our work, all of our live streams and resources that you can find are free. We do create them for free, but we would really, really appreciate a small donation, whatever you can afford. So feel free to come and become a patron member via Patreon. You can actually find extra resources and things by being a patron of Aucademy. We also have other resources. We also have lists of training that we can deliver to organisations or schools, anywhere and everywhere that will listen to an autistic person talking about and training on autistic experience. So you can find further resources, blogs, lists of books that we think are useful and so on at aucademy.co.uk. We also, every single week, deliver weekly live streams, and we will stream those again for free from Facebook or to Facebook, so Aucademy's Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. Again, we really do appreciate, though, if you can support us in any way, whether that's by donating via Patreon or just sharing our work is really, really important as well, so we can get this work out and find lots of autistic people who might benefit from learning from autistic people themselves. We also have on Aucademy autistic only groups on Facebook, and we have one Discord server which is for 13 years plus with parental consent, and they are, as it sounds, autistic only groups where the majority of our main platforms are open access to anybody. We also have covered so many topics already. So Aucademy has been going since very early 2020. So we've covered lots and lots of topics in depth by only autistic educators coming on and being guests. So feel free to go and look at our back catalogue, which is probably more accessible via YouTube, but you can also find our back catalogue on our Facebook page. And so while these are Aucademy bite-sized basics for people, a lot of the topics that we cover on Aucademy on Facebook and Twitter every week tend to be much more lengthy. Sometimes we go for about 2 hours and they cover lots of topics, and sometimes those topics are a little bit more advanced. So if you're already up to speed now with all the bite-sized things that we've covered so far here, then you might find a lot of the work that we've already done and will continue to do on our main page as longer sessions really important and interesting for yourself as an autistic person, or if you're a non-autistic wanting to understand autistic people.